So it's fun to be here. I want to talk to you about social science this morning, and in particular this field that I've been involved with for several years now, which we call computational social science. So just to give you a sense of, and many of you probably, if you're like most people, are a little unclear like what social science actually is and what makes it social. So my sort of personal view on this is that the kinds of phenomenon that social scientists study, whether you're a sociologist or an economist or a political scientist, all intrinsically involve large numbers of people interacting with each other. Right? So if we think about organizations or firms or political parties or markets or cultures, these are the objects, the actors that social scientists are interested in. But we also realize that at some level, these are all just convenient fictions that we're talking about, that at the root level, it's actually just people, and these people are interacting with each other in complicated ways over time, and they're producing this kind of emergent level phenomenon that we're studying. And so in sociology, we call this the micro-macro problem. How do you get from the level of individual people to this macro level of social facts and phenomena? And so the sort of central challenge that we face as social scientists is that these problems are just intrinsically difficult to study. So why are they difficult? If you're talking about hundreds or thousands or millions of people interacting with each other, just trying to observe those interactions over time is already an extraordinary empirical exercise. It's something that, for most of the history of social science, you couldn't even imagine how you would do that. You just had to kind of assume that that was going on and you go and measure something else. But if you want to understand cause and effect, and this is something you'll be hearing some talks about later today, you have to do something more than just observe. You have to actually intervene. You have to run experiments. And doing macro-scale experiments on social systems that involve people, is not only more difficult, it's often impossible or unethical. And so you have these tremendous constraints on what you can do. And so this makes social science just a different kind of exercise from physical science or biological science, where you can kind of set up labs and you can study things under controlled circumstances. And so if you think about the scientific method, where you generate your hypothesis and then you design your experiment and you go and measure things and then you test your hypothesis, you sort of can't do the second 2/3 of this much of the time. And so if you think about what's happened over the last 100 years, social science has generated a tremendous number of interesting theories about the world, but our ability to test these theories and decide between them has been extremely limited. So the exciting thing about what's happened in the last 10 or 15 years is that the technological revolution of the web and the internet and digital communication and other related technologies is starting to lift some of these long-standing barriers. And so there's two specific ways in which this is happening. The first is the sort of the big data revolution, where people are going about their ordinary business. They're communicating with each other. They're participating in social media. They're talking on the phone. They're sending email. They're collaborating, and in the process, they're engaging in e-commerce. And in the process, they're spewing off this enormous amount of data that is by good fortune, interesting to social scientists. So we have this kind of passive data collection exercise just happening in real time, and we can benefit from all of this data to ask interesting questions, or to ask the same questions that we've been asking all along, but we can bring new data to bear on them. And the second thing that's happening is that we can also use the web to run experiments in ways that are quite distinct from what we've been able to do in the past, or they're analogous to that, but they're distinct in terms of speed and scale. So, one thing that I'll talk about this morning is how we've taken this traditional model of the lab experiment that you're probably all familiar with from college, you probably either saw these things or participated in them where there's some sort of lab experiment happening in the psychology department. So there's a version of that that can be done online now, and also field experiments, which perhaps Sinan Aral will talk about today. And so if you kind of lump all of this together in a very loose sense, this is what we really refer to as computational social science, this intersection of questions that come from the social sciences and methods that come from the computational sciences. And so this is a very active area of research right now, and there's a lot of excitement in this area. We just ran the second international conference on computational social science this past June in Chicago, and there's another one happening in Germany next year. So this is an area that's really getting off the ground. So just to be a bit more concrete, I want to spend the rest of the talk really just discussing two examples of what I mean by computational social science that illustrate these two types of data collection. So the first one is using sort of passively collected data from online sources to study this very old question about social contagion, how things spread. And the second one is using a highly designed system where we set up a lab experiment that we have designed ourselves, and we recruit people in to participate to understand another old question about how people solve problems in teams. And so what's, a couple of things that I find interesting about this work is, first that all of it is motivated by these long-standing questions that we have in social science, going back decades or possibly even longer. But we are also using these questions to drive kind of new methodologies that allow us to shed new light on these questions. And then finally, if I have time, we can also discuss, what this work shows us as problematic. That we're able to do lots of interesting things, but in the course of doing these things, we also realize that we have all these new problems that we didn't necessarily have before, and that hopefully charts out a path for the future of computational social science. So I'll just jump right in, start talking about the first example. So when you think about contagion, you probably have a mental model that looks something like the following. And this is a model that underlies essentially all of the formal mathematical models that have been proposed in the literature, all of which are essentially come from a notion of biological contagion. So the words that we use when we talk about things going viral or things spreading or diffusing throughout a population come from this biological metaphor in which this mental model is pretty accurate. Right? So if you think about the Ebola epidemic that started in West Africa a couple of years ago, it really was the case that a single person, an index person like that red dot in the middle there, was infected by the Ebola virus, jumping across from some animal reservoir, and then that person went home and infected a small number of his or her family members or neighbors, and each one of them got sick and infected a few of their neighbors, and each one of them got sick and infected a few of their neighbors, and over the course of several months, you see thousands of people getting infected, and through this multi-step branching process. So you sort of imagine, at every stage, only a few people are getting infected by each infected person, but this is happening over and over again, and you're getting exponential growth. And so when we talk about things going viral in the social sphere, we have the same mental model. We assume that something like this is happening, except rather than a disease being passed along, it's an idea or a piece of information or a behavioral trait. And in fact, most of the models that we use to describe social contagion are based on this assumption as well. So the problem is that when we measure things spreading in the social world, we don't actually have data that looks like that mental model. Typically what we have, or historically what we've had, is data that looks like this, where you have some kind of aggregate measure of the total number of people who have adopted a product or who have retweeted a tweet or have clicked on a YouTube video, and you can measure that over time. And so typically what you get is a curve that looks like an S-shaped curve, where you see some early period where a few people are paying attention to it, and then you see this exponential growth period, and then you see some kind of asymptote where the susceptible population gets exhausted and the epidemic dies out. And so the assumption is that whenever you see an S-shaped curve, there's some contagion process which is happening underneath, because if you simulate one of these models, you get something that looks like that. The problem empirically is that you can get S-shaped curves in lots of other ways as well. So just because your model generates an S-shaped curve, and just because you see an S-shaped curve in the wild, doesn't mean that your model is explaining or causing the thing that you're looking at. And in fact, there are lots of different ways to generate S-shaped curves, some of which have nothing to do with contagion at all. So even if you just assume that there's some kind of heterogeneity in your population, people just have different propensity to click on the thing or to adopt the thing, you can easily generate S-shaped curves. If you introduce any kind of marketing or media effort, you can get any shaped curve you want, including an S-shaped curve. And so you really can't reject any other model either from that sort of evidence. But there's a more subtle and even more difficult problem with S-shaped curves, which is that, historically, data collection has been so expensive that social scientists typically only study things that succeed, right? So if you look at the history of diffusion studies, they study things that have diffused, right? So you think, well, what else would they study? How can you study a thing that didn't diffuse? Well, it's difficult, but the problem is that most things don't diffuse. And if your model is trying to explain when something diffuses, what causes successful diffusion, you have to be able to study the things that don't diffuse as well. So it's just like if you want to understand, what makes certain people successful or what makes certain companies successful, you can't just go and look at successful people and successful companies. And this may seem surprising, because if you go and look at the business books in the airport, that's what all of them do. They go and interview successful people and say, what did you do? And then they kind of find some common themes, and then they make some thesis that says, well, here's 100 successful people, here's the things they told us, this is how you become successful. But it turns out that, successful people eat breakfast, right? And, eating breakfast is not a strong predictor of success, because unsuccessful people also eat breakfast. And it turns out this is one of these sort of stupid things that, like correlation is not causation, that everybody sort of knows, and then everybody immediately ignores when they go on and do the thing that they're about to do. So the lesson here is that if you want to understand what causes diffusion, you have to get all the things that didn't diffuse as well. And so this is something that we can now do with online data. We can get individual person-to-person level observations, and we can get them for something like a total sample of everything that's, in some sense, trying to diffuse, or everything that's at risk of diffusing. And so this is a relatively recent area. It only goes back about a decade now, but there's been a growing list of examples, and it's a much longer list now. This is a little bit out of date. Of papers where people have exploited web data to study diffusion, and it allows us to ask questions about how much, when we see diffusion, how much of it is really viral, and what do we even mean by viral? Like, can we be sort of quantitative about what something, a viral thing looks like, as opposed to some other kind of spread? So the first attempt that we made to study these questions was several years ago, when I was at Yahoo Research with Sharad Goyal and Dan Goldstein, and we gathered together several different projects that we had worked on and that other people at Yahoo Research had worked on that were all originally intended to study some other kind of question. So we had built a Facebook app to study how people are similar to their friends with respect to their political beliefs. And we had studied we had helped the Yahoo philanthropic team to set up an experiment around the holiday season to get people to encourage their friends to do something nice for a stranger, a kind of pay it forward style of social engagement. Our colleagues had built this video viewing app that allowed people to watch videos synchronously and chat with each other while they were doing it. So these are completely different projects. They're sort of a little bit of a random selection. They varied greatly in size. Some of them had hundreds of people. Some of them had tens of thousands of people involved. The only thing that they had in common was that they all had some kind of social referral mechanism built into them. That we wanted, they all were, in some sense, intended to spread through a social process. Other than that, the variety, the heterogeneity across applications was, as far as we were concerned, a feature. And the reason is that every single one of them was, the data collection was very biased. You know, the people who were on Facebook back then were sort of different from other people. The people who were on Twitter back then were different from other people. The people who were participating in the video viewing app were different from other people. So you have this sort of non-representative biased sample of the population. They're interacting with each other in some sort of strange way that might not generalize to other kinds of cases. So if you just looked at one such example, whatever result you found, someone could say, well, you know, that doesn't apply to anything else, right? This is just sort of only restricted to your very sort of strange example. So if you have several different strange examples that are all biased in different ways, and you find the same empirical regularity across them, then you have a much stronger claim that your results are robust. And so what we found was actually astonishingly, at least to us, astonishingly similar across these examples. So here you have 6 different examples, and in every example, every domain, what I'm showing you here is the 5 most common structures that we observe. So just to interpret this, if we look at the top right example, which is labeled Twitter, so this is a set of 40 million tweets, which sounded like a big number back in 2009, but is you get every day now. The first little dot there is telling you that 93% of the time when somebody introduces a piece of content represented by a URL into Twitter, nobody pays attention to it. Okay, so this may reflect your experience with Twitter where you're talking and it's just sort of going off into the ether and nobody's paying attention to you. If you've had that experience, you're in good company. 93% of the time, that happens to everybody. 5% of the time, one of your followers retweets your tweet, right? 0.9% of the time, 2 of your followers retweet. 0.3% of the time, 3 of them retweet it. And 0.3% of the time, you see something that starts to look a little bit like viral spread, where one of your followers retweets it, and then one of their followers, who's not one of your followers, retweets it, right? So that's the interpretation of these little motifs or structures. And what's striking is that in every case, we find almost exactly the same set of motifs. So there's 5 possible motifs for each domain. There's 6 domains, so there's 30 possible structures that we might see as the most frequent structures. And we only see 7 structures, right? So there's tremendous consistency across these domains. And even more than that, the numbers are actually pretty similar. And so what we can do is lump all of these observations together and draw this meta conclusion that about 90% of the time when things are trying to spread, they don't spread, right? So most of the time, nothing happens. And then most of the rest of the time, very little happens, right? So about 8% of the time, you get 1 subsequent adoption. About 1% of the time, you get 2 subsequent adoptions. And then everything else, everything you've ever heard of, every viral video, every meme, everything that you read about, everything that your friends are talking about, is in that little blue bar on the right-hand side. This 1% of the time, something else happens. And so you might think, well, that's sort of interesting, but I still don't care because I know that these things, when they happen, are so big that they really drive everything. That if you think about if you go back to biological disease for a moment, the Spanish flu, which it was a global epidemic that happened almost exactly a century ago, was a very rare event. There's been lots of instances of influenza. This was just one of them, but this one event infected 1 billion people and infected a third of the world's population. You wouldn't want to just throw that out because it's a rare event, because these rare events can be so consequential that they essentially drive everything else. It turns out that's not the case in this data. We don't have Spanish flu-like events. In fact, what we can show is a stronger statement that if you look at all the adoptions, everything that happened, not just the things that initiated cascades, but all the people in all of the cascades, 99% of them were only one hop from the seed. Right? So we sort of have this intuition that things are kind of spreading in these large cascades, but in fact, almost everything that we see looks like one of these little motifs here. And so you might say, well, that's sort of interesting, but I think probably what you're doing is just ignoring the most interesting stuff. And in fact, that was exactly the feedback we got when we published this paper. Our colleagues said, thanks for that. But we know this stuff happens. Like, we know that Gangnam Style was viewed by a couple of billion people around the world. I'm interested in those events, right? I don't care how rare they are. So let's focus on those sorts of events for a moment. If we see something that is enormously successful, like a Gangnam Style, we can still ask the question, is this thing viral or is it just popular? And in fact, what do we even mean by viral? Like when we see that something gets 1 billion views, that's really all we know. We know that it just acquired a huge amount of views. But a lot of people watch the Super Bowl as well, right? The Super Bowl has maybe 100 million viewers. No one would describe the Super Bowl as a viral phenomenon, right? It's just popular, right? It's a huge broadcast event. Everybody goes to the same location and they watch it on the same news channel simultaneously. And so if we were to map a broadcast event out in the same kind of graphical language that we were using to look at those motifs, it would just look like a big blob where you have one node at the center and then everybody looks at that one node. Versus the viral model that I showed you earlier, where you have this sort of multi-stage branching structure. And so again, when we see that something's popular, all we know is how many counts we have over time. We don't know what the structure is of the underlying diffusion process. And that's what we'd like to look at. And so that led us to a second project, which again with Sharad Goyal, but also with Ashton Anderson and Jake Hoffman, my colleagues at Microsoft Research. We took a much larger data set, about a billion tweets over the course of a year. Again, this seemed like a big number back in a couple of years ago, but you can get 1 billion tweets in a month now. So what counts as big data keeps changing all the time. But this was 1 billion tweets over the course of 12 months. More or less everything that contained a link to a video or a news story or an image or a petition that was posted to Twitter for a 12-month period. So if anything is going to go viral, we're going to see it. And then the second thing we did is we threw out everything that you could sort of argue wasn't intended to be popular, right? So one of the critiques of these, one of the tricky parts of doing this kind of study is like clearly a lot of stuff that people post to Twitter, it's never supposed to spread, right? They're just posting it because they're interested in it or because they want to show it to a family member or something. So you could argue that it's sort of unfair to count everything. So we just throw out everything that isn't plausibly popular. And so in fact, we have a very high threshold for that. We only look at things that have at least 100 retweets. So these things are way more popular than anything that I just showed you on the previous slide. So this is like 1 in 3,000 events qualifies as being in our data set. So we're looking at extremely rare events, but because we have over 1 billion of them to start with, we still get 350,000 of these rare events. So this is where the big part of the big data starts to help you, is that when you're studying rare events, and you need to have a lot of them, you need to have an enormous population to begin with. Okay, so for each one of these cascades, which are at least 100 retweets in size, we can study this property that we define called structural virality. And so what we mean by it is that if you look at one of these, if you let something diffuse, so it goes through its whole process of cascading, and at the end of it you have some trace of where it's been. Right? So this is the pattern that you see, and now that you have this structure, you can compute properties of it. And so the property that we're going to compute is a fairly simple one, which is just the average path length. So how many steps does it take to get from anyone to anyone else in this structure, which we're just going to treat as a network or a graph or whatever you want to call it. So something that is a broadcast node, where somebody introduces something and a lot of people retweet it and then nothing else happens, that's going to have an average path length of close to 2. Right? So the smallest structural virality you can have is 2. And then if you get one of these very large multi-step branching processes, the depth of that tree is going to be proportional to the log of the number of nodes in the tree, and so the average path length is also going to be proportional to log n. So for every one of these structures, you get some number that's somewhere between 2 and log n. And so now you can compute that number for all 350,000 of these events, and you can start asking empirical questions about them. So, how much diversity do you expect to see, for example? So if you look at big events, do they tend to be very viral in this structural sense, lots and lots of generations of branching, or do they tend to be very broadcasty, right? And then you can also ask, well, as you look at things of different sizes, do they become more viral or more broadcasty? And so you can sort of imagine make a private prediction. I won't make anybody put their hands up, but you can, imagine, like, well, what do you think is like the optimal way to spread? Like, what kind of structure is going to generate the most spreading? Is it going to be a broadcast? Is it going to be a viral thing? Is it going to be some kind of optimal combination of the two? And so you can come up with all kinds of stories about what you imagine will work better. And the first answer is that whatever story you came up with, you're right? That there's something in there that looks like what you're imagining. There is so the first lesson here is that there is tremendous diversity in this sort of huge population of things that are spreading. We find almost everything, right? And so if we rank, so the first thing to note about these pictures is they all have about the same number of nodes in them. So everything in here is roughly as popular as everything else, right? But the structure is wildly different. So the thing up on the top left is that looks like a big black triangle with some paint dripping off it. Like, that is a huge broadcast node. So that is a CNN story, and so CNN has lots of followers. So they post a news story and a whole bunch of people retweet it, and then basically nothing much else happens, right? All the way down on the bottom right was a sort of remarkable obit in the New York Times about this World War II hero who had led this sort of incredibly interesting life, but was not somebody that anybody had heard of. And so it wasn't a famous person, but people found this very interesting, and so it got a lot of retweets. But the structure of these retweets was totally different, right? That you have many, many generations where just a few people at each generation are retweeting the previous tweet. So the first lesson here is you have tremendous diversity in structure. The second lesson is if you look at these little inserts underneath the figures, that's showing you what you would have seen sort of in the old world, where you just got the count with respect to time. So this is the non-structural data. And you can see that almost all of these things look the same. Like, there's no way you could rank these things properly if you just saw popularity over time. The structure is really telling us something different about the about the nature of the spreading thing. So this is a metric which is now going into Bing, where we can use this as another way to rank popular events, and the hope is that we uncover some other feature of interestingness that is different from just flat-out popularity. So the second question, how do things change with size, is also somewhat surprising. So this now is breaking all these events up by domain and plotting the structural virality by popularity. So each one of these bins contains tweets or cascades of roughly the same size, and the box plot shows you the interquartile range of the structural virality, and the black bars show you the median. And so there's a couple of interesting things here. For pictures and videos, we see almost no correlation between structural virality and size. So big things are no more viral in this structural sense than small things. And the reason is that on Twitter you have these incredibly connected individuals, like I don't know who the most popular person is anymore. I think Katy Perry overtook Justin Bieber last year. But they have 80 million followers. So I mean, they're sort of enormously connected individuals. And if one of them gets involved, then they can really generate a huge number of retweets. And so essentially what's happening here is that the size of the entire structure is driven by the size of the largest broadcast in that structure. And so this is what we used to call this the Justin Bieber effect, but I guess it's now the Katy Perry effect or whatever. And it turns out that celebrities, so almost all the most followed people on Twitter are celebrities, and celebrities are exclusively interested in themselves. So they don't tweet about the news, right? They just tweet pictures and videos. So if you look at pictures and videos, it's highly celebrity driven, and so you see no correlation. With news, you see more of a correlation. Petitions are also interesting because they are just more viral on average, right? So I think you're sort of seeing interesting level domain effects here. But just to sum up, I think sort of the theoretical lesson here, and this is something that's interesting to me in particular because I've been involved in this theoretical literature for 20 years now, and there's thousands of papers written about models of diffusion, and really they're all concerned with this notion of a threshold where when you get above a certain critical level of infectiousness, you go from things dying out to things spreading exponentially. And if you're an epidemiologist, you want to get everything below this critical threshold because you don't want things to spread. And if you're a social marketing person, you want to get everything above the threshold because you want your thing to go viral. But everyone is sort of worried about this tipping point. And what we find is that this is a very misleading analogy, right? That everything we see is below this critical threshold. Everything is dying out all the time. And the only thing that is driving it are these big hubs, these large seeds. So we have to sort of think differently about how things spread in a social environment than how they spread in a biological environment. And so we need to kind of break this historical analogy that we've been relying on for our models. And of course, once you understand that, then you can also think differently about how you're going to apply this in practice. And finally, I think again in my world, there's sort of a lot of criticism of big data because it has all kinds of problems that I'm sure you know about. But this is really an example where the size of the data set is really helpful. That if you're looking for rare events, and it's a number of places in social science where we do in fact care about rare events, it's very difficult to study rare events. And this is, so having a large data set like this really enables you to do things that historically you could not do. Okay. So, what are we doing on time here? Okay, so I want to talk about the second problem now, which is using a different type of data generating mechanism, a lab environment to study problem solving. And how much time do we have? How many? A few minutes. Oh, okay. All right, let me just try to sum up. So we're interested in how groups of people solve problems. Just trust me, people have been thinking about this for a long time. We have no idea. We would like to do this in an experimental setting. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we can now take this historical model of the lab, which you see on the, in the sort of grainy black and white picture here, and we can do it online using sites like Amazon's Mechanical Turk. And so the problem that we studied is a problem that you may have heard of. It's called crisis mapping. This is a real thing that people do in the world when there's a crisis happening somewhere, like a natural disaster, like in Haiti, the earthquake in 2010. Volunteers sort of assemble online, and what they do is they monitor all the social media activity of users on the ground, and they classify all this noisy, unstructured data to find where things are damaged, where people are needing help, and they can then hand this cleaned up, structured data set in the form of a map, hence crisis map, to an agency like the UN, which is then uses the map to direct resources. So this is a useful thing. It's a complex task. It's a real world task. And what we're interested in is using this task as a way to understand how people collaborate in a controlled environment. And so this is a virtual lab experiment using software that was developed by one of our postdocs, Andrew Mao. So this runs on Meteor and uses some software that he wrote called Turk Server, which recruits people from Amazon Mechanical Turk and then brings them into this experimental setting. And what they're doing here is we give them about 1,500 tweets, which are real tweets from Twitter users in the Philippines in December 2012, when the Philippines was hit by a typhoon, Typhoon Pablo. And so you can see what happened is this typhoon swept through the center of the Philippines there, and people are tweeting about it. And most of these tweets are not very informative, but some of them contain very concrete information about damage on the ground. And so the objective is that these group of Turkers have to find the relevant tweets, extract the relevant information from those tweets, classify these events in terms of, is it damaged housing, is it displaced population, are the deaths reported, what is the description, and then they have to geolocate them on this map. And this is difficult because these are not geotagged tweets. You have to sort of do some sleuthing to figure out like where this is. And then they are putting it, they're then creating this map. And they're doing all of this in the course of an hour, right? So this is this sort of complex, ambiguous exercise. They're not given a lot of training in it in advance. And so they're also trying to figure out how to do it. So there's a lot of chatting going on here. And so we're really sort of studying this very rich team collaborative exercise with a relatively clean performance outcome, which is how good a job do they do of creating this map. And globally, they do pretty well, right? So this is the actual map, which was produced by 32 volunteers over 12 hours in 2012. And then this is the map that our experiment subjects produced in 1 hour a couple of years later, and they're actually quite similar. The difference is that we are able to measure everything. So we can see every action that everyone takes, everything that everybody says to somebody else, and so we can look at communication, we can look at division of labor, and we can look at performance. And we can do this for a large number of groups of different sizes, and we can, for each one of the maps, we can construct a fairly clean measure of quality, how well they are able to identify the events that matter. And so the sort of short version is that if you look at how the performance varies with the size of the team, it's it's true that teams, larger teams, do better than smaller teams, so that seems reasonable. But it's also clear that there's this sort of strong diminishing returns to scale, right? That larger teams are not doing proportionally better than individuals. And so maybe you think, well, and so you can ask why that is, and the answer is that people tend to slack off when they're around other people. So this is a phenomenon called, that psychologists call social loafing, economists call it free riding. So all this sounds very plausible, but then something else turns up, which is that in larger teams, there's this other benefit that you get from being in a team, which is that people are kind of are checking each other's work. People are realizing that they're both working on the same problem and eliminating redundancies. And so even though so there's sort of tension here where you find that when there are other people around, you're less likely to work as hard. But when there are other people around, you get some sort of benefit as well. And so you want to try to balance up these two competing forces. It's unclear which one is more salient. And so we have a way of doing that by creating synthetic groups out of individual workers. So we have all these people who are doing this on their own, and we can combine their maps to create what they would have done if we had treated them as a team. And so we find this very kind of interesting and I think non-obvious result, which is that if we compare the synthetic teams to the real teams, the blue line is the synthetic teams, the green line is the real teams, that for up to a certain critical size, the synthetic teams are doing better. So the sort of per capita effort is winning for a while, but then as the team size increases, the error checking and deduping that happens in the real teams starts to win out. And so at the largest team levels, largest team sizes, you find that teams are actually better than individuals. And interestingly, the red line shows you the performance of the actual standby task force. So as a sort of measure of external validity, we're running an experiment here that is almost exactly, it's not exactly like real life, but it's very close to real life. And so this is something that is tremendously exciting to us because, again, if you go back through the history of lab experiments, they tend to be extremely artificial. And so you can conduct these sort of nice, clean experiments, but then you have to kind of wave your hands about how the result plays out in real life, where lots of other things are going on as well, and it's much messier. And so if we want to understand how real teams and real organizations perform and what is which factors drive performance, we have to be able to strike a balance between lab-like control and naturalism. And so this is sort of getting much closer to that. So I think we are out of time, but I just want to say that sort of end on a note of caution that this has been an extremely exciting past decade. There are things that we can do now that were quite unimaginable to us just a decade ago in terms of the questions that we can answer, the data that we can collect. So there's really enormous excitement. There's new conferences, there's new research centers, there's new journals, new funding agencies. So there's a lot of interest in computational approaches to social science. But there are some very large challenges. Like in some sense, we are not any closer than we were 10 or 15 years ago to answering the big questions of social science that kind of got all of us into this profession to begin with. And so going forward, I think we have to ask ourselves some serious questions about how we're going to get the data that is the right data. So it's great to study retweets on Twitter, but in some sense, we don't really care about Twitter. We care about, how does health behavior spread through, through the population? How do cultural beliefs change? Like these are the things that matter to the world, and these are the things that matter to social science. And you can kind of squint your eyes and imagine that what we're studying on Twitter is sort of like this other stuff that we really care about. But at the end of the day, we have to really study the thing that we care about, and that's going to require some serious conversations between us, and also between us and industry, in terms of what we can measure, how we can build the instruments that are most relevant to us, and how we can take what is sort of intriguing and thought-provoking and turn it into something that is consequential for business and also for society. So on that note, thanks very much.